The floor manager seized Sorcha Finley's arm hard enough that the folder of corrected receipts slipped from her hand. "You will go in there and fix this," Bryce Leonard hissed, his voice cracking at the edges. "Or I swear to God you'll be clearing your desk before midnight." Sorcha looked at her arm, then at him. She picked up the scattered receipts with her free hand, and he let go, not because he'd reconsidered, but because her calm made him feel foolish. She'd been a financial controller at Thornfield Club for 4 years. She'd corrected invoices at 2 a.m, absorbed every seating preference of every member worth remembering, and quietly covered for colleagues who'd called in sick during the worst possible shifts. She knew the name of every server, every porter, every dishwasher for bringing coffee, to the Badlankta for bringing kushin, wine to the back kitchen on a January night. What she didn't usually do was walk into private dining rooms during crises. But tonight, Bryce was dissolving. The crew party had reserved the Ashwood room 6 weeks in advance. 9 guests, 5 courses, and the standing instruction, written in red ink in the reservation system, that everything be flawless, because Irina Crew was attending. Everyone at Thornfield knew about Irina Crew, even those who'd never seen her. The woman had buried 3 business rivals and outlasted 2 mayors. She'd funded half a children's hospital in her late husband's name, and then, in the same month, ensured that overcharged her contractor never worked in the city again. She didn't make threats. She simply remembered. And people who disappointed Irina, Crew tended to find that eventually every door they approached had already been quietly closed. Tonight, a server named Callum, 22, 7 weeks into the job, doing his best, had set a chilled water glass too close to the edge of the table while reaching across to adjust a bread plate. The glass tipped. The water spread fast and cold across the white linen, directly in front of Irina. Callum stood rigid, his mouth open. Now Sorcha pushed through the Ashwood room door. The room was very still. 8 guests watched the ruined linen the way people watch a car accident, transfixed, unable to look away. Callum stood frozen near the sideboard, and at the head of the table sat Irina Crew, silver-haired, impeccably straight-backed, wearing a dove-grey blazer with a single pearl at her collar, looking at no one in particular with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. Sorcha didn't go to Callum. She didn't launch into an apology. She crossed the room at a measured pace, stopped beside Irina's chair, and crouched slightly so that she was speaking at eye level rather than hovering above her. "Ma'am," she said quietly. "The water went cold fast. Did it touch your hand at all?" Irina turned her head and looked at her. The room's silence changed quality. It had been the silence of held breath. Now it became something else, the silence of people who have just witnessed something they weren't expecting and aren't sure what to do with it. "I only ask," Sorcha continued, unhurried, "because cold water on the wrist can be a shock if you weren't bracing for it. Not dangerous, just unpleasant." She paused. "I'll have fresh linen brought immediately, but I wanted to check on you first." Irina studied her. Not unkindly, but with the focused attention of someone who spent their life reading rooms and had just encountered something that didn't fit the expected pattern. "It touched my sleeve," Irina said finally, "not my skin." "Good." Sorcha nodded once, genuinely relieved. "That's good." She stood. "I'll see to the table now." She turned to Callum, who looked as though he was waiting to be executed. "Would you bring the fresh linen from the second service station?" she asked. "The one with the heavier weight. It'll sit better." It was phrased as a request. It gave him something to do, and it gave him the walk down the hall to collect himself. He went. His hands were still trembling when he left. Bryce, who had followed Sorcha into the room despite himself, made a sound like he was attempting an apology. Irina didn't look at him. Her attention had remained, inexplicably, on the woman who had just crouched beside her chair and asked whether she was all right. "What is your name?" Irena asked. Sorcha had retrieved the damp linen from the table and folded it over her arm. Sorcha Finley, I manage the accounts here. You're not a server. No, but you came in anyway. Sorcha considered the question honestly. Someone needed to. The answer landed in the room and stayed there. By the time fresh linen was laid, wine poured, and the first course arrived without incident, the tension had resettled into something closer to warmth. Irena had not demanded anyone's dismissal. She had not asked for compensation. She had addressed a question to the table about a concert she'd attended the previous week, and conversation had resumed. Sorcha left the room the way she'd entered, quietly and without fanfare. In the hallway, Bryce was waiting. She expected either gratitude or criticism, and was prepared for neither to particularly move her. She didn't make a scene, Bryce said. No, Sorcha agreed. What did you say to her? I asked if she was cold. Bryce opened his mouth and then closed it again. Sorcha returned to her office and finished the reconciliation she'd been working on before the evening's detour. She heard the knock at 9:45. It was Patricia, one of the senior servers who'd worked at Thornfield longer than almost anyone, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. Mrs. Crewe asked for you before she left, Patricia said, with the directness of someone who had decided to say a thing and was getting on with it. She said to tell the woman from accounts that the evening, in spite of everything, had been memorable. Patricia paused. Then she tipped every server individually, by name. She'd never done that before, not once, not in 8 years. She left without waiting for a response. By Tuesday, the story had spread through Thornfield the way any story spreads through a small building, embellished, then re-embellished, then reduced back to its core by the people who'd actually been present and were tired of the distortions. Sorcha had asked whether Irena Crewe was all right. That was all. That was apparently the whole extraordinary event. Miriam Thane heard it differently. Miriam was a shift supervisor who had been at Thornfield 3 years longer than Sorcha and had always managed, through a sustained and quiet campaign of positioning, to ensure that her name came up in the same breath as any notable evening. She had a gift for proximity to success and a corresponding intolerance for it, arriving in forms she hadn't arranged. She began with small things, the way that kind of damage always begins. She knew exactly what she was doing, of course, Miriam said to a junior server over the glasses cabinet on Wednesday afternoon. Sorcha's not stupid. She saw an opportunity. The junior server frowned. To do what? Miriam shrugged with studied lightness. To be noticed. The Crewe family controls 6 corporate accounts through this club. You think it's a coincidence that the accounts manager is the one who walks into that room? The server didn't respond, but he didn't disagree. The seed was planted, which was all Miriam needed. By Thursday, variations of the same suggestion had been introduced to 4 other members of staff. By Friday, Sorcha noticed the break room went slightly quiet when she walked in. She was not oblivious. She'd grown up quiet and heavy in a school where neither quality was particularly useful, and she'd learned early to read a room's temperature. She recognized the particular coolness of people who have recently been told something about you and haven't decided yet whether to believe it. She chose not to raise it. She'd found over the years that confronting gossip directly usually only convinced the doubters that you were both guilty and defensive. The only reliable counter was time and consistency. So she kept going. She brought coffee to the kitchen staff on Friday morning. She helped a new hostess memorize the club's private room configurations during a slow Tuesday lunch. When a young porter dropped an entire tray of club soda near the main staircase, Sorcha was the first person on the floor with a mop and a steady voice, and she didn't mention it to Bryce afterward. Miriam, watching from across the lobby one afternoon, observed two servers leave Sorcha's company laughing at something and return to work with lighter expressions. She folded her arms. She had spent years cultivating the impression that success at Thornfield required her approval. Sorcha had done something infuriating. Without trying, without networking, without adjusting herself for anyone, she had become the person people wanted to be around. And there was no tactic in Miriam's repertoire designed for that particular problem. Irina Crew returned to Thornfield on a rainy Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the private dinner. She came alone. No driver at the entrance, no assistant trailing behind. She wore a navy wool coat, low-heeled boots, a plain silver watch at her wrist, and she sat in the club's public lounge and waited to be seated like any other member without a reservation. The hostess on duty apologized for the wait, offered a menu, and hurried off to check availability. 12 minutes passed. Irina sat very still and watched the room. Sorcha came through the lounge en route to the printer room, a stack of revised quarterly reports under one arm. She stopped when she saw the older woman sitting alone. She didn't immediately connect the face to the name. She connected it to something simpler. A guest waiting too long, without water, without acknowledgement. She set the reports on the side table by the window. "I'm sorry you've been waiting. Has anyone come back to you?" Irina looked up. Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition, but she gave no indication of it outwardly. "The young woman said she'd check on a table," Irina said. "That was a while ago." Sorcha didn't make excuses for the club. "Can I bring you something while you wait?" "We have a Darjeeling right now that's quite good, or a ginger blend, if you'd prefer something warming." Irina considered it with the gravity she appeared to bring to all decisions. The Darjeeling. Sorcha went to the kitchen, made the tea herself, not because she was performing anything, but because the kitchen was mid-prep, and pulling someone off the line for a single pot would have caused a ripple she didn't want to create, and returned with the pot, a cup, a small ceramic dish of sugar cubes, and 2 shortbread biscuits on a separate plate. Irina looked at the biscuits. "I didn't order those." "I know." Sorcha set down the tray. "Waiting tends to go better with something to eat." She straightened. "I'll check on your table." She found the hostess, sorted it within 4 minutes, and returned to escort Irina to a window seat. Irina had finished one of the shortbreads and was looking out at the rain. "This spot gets afternoon light when it's clear," Sorcha said, pulling out the chair. "The view isn't much today, but the street sounds different in the rain." "Quieter." Irina sat. "You notice that sort of thing?" "I suppose I do." She didn't overstay. She confirmed the table had everything it needed and returned to her reports. Irina remained for 90 minutes. She ordered a light lunch, a second pot of tea, the apple tart, and she finished all of it. When she left, she stopped at the front desk and asked for the name of the woman who had brought her tea in the lounge. The hostess told her. Irina nodded once and left. The letter arrived at Thornfield the following Monday, addressed to Sorcha Finley by name, in cream-colored stationery with a discreet embossed letterhead, Crew Family Foundation. Bryce found Sorcha before she'd even opened it. "The Crew Foundation sent something. For you, with your name on it." He repeated this as though one of the 3 facts might change upon further examination. Sorcha opened it in her office, alone. "Miss Finley, I am reaching out on behalf of the Crew Family Foundation. We are developing a series of community hospitality initiatives and would welcome your perspective. If you would be willing to meet, please contact my assistant at the number below. I, Crew." No preamble, no flattery. Just a direct question, which Sorcha appreciated more than she could have explained to anyone. She called that afternoon. The foundation occupied the upper 2 floors of a converted warehouse building in the east end of the city. The renovation had kept the original brick and the industrial windows and added nothing for show. Inside, it was warm. Children's drawings were framed in the main corridor. Volunteers greeted each other by name in the kitchen. There were fresh flowers on every table, arranged with thought rather than purchased by the armful. Sorcha arrived 15 minutes early and stood in the lobby reading the photographs on the wall. Community meals, school programs, a youth employment initiative that had apparently been running for 11 years. You read the whole wall. She turned. Irina Crow stood behind her with a coffee cup in one hand and the expression of someone who had been watching for a while and found it interesting. I didn't hear you come in. I'm aware. Irina gestured toward the corridor. Come, we have a lot to discuss. They sat in a meeting room with a long table and a window overlooking the courtyard below, where 2 volunteers were carrying folding chairs through a light drizzle and laughing about something. Irina explained the initiative. Community dinners, not in the church basement sense, but proper ones. Tables with real linens, minas. Servers, trained to treat every guest the way a fine dining establishment would. The point was dignity. The point was that a meal served to someone in crisis didn't have to feel like charity to still be charitable. Sorcha had thought something similar, approximately once a week, for most of her adult life. You've been thinking about this for a long time, she said. My husband used to say that generosity without dignity is just performance. Irina looked at her cup. I'd been trying to build something he would have recognized. How long has he been gone? 7 years. A pause, long enough to stop expecting to find him in rooms where he used to be. Sorcha said nothing, because nothing was the right response. She understood it. The particular quietness of grief that has been integrated into the body, like a weight you've learned to carry, not because it's lighter, but because you've simply grown stronger around it. I lost my mother when I was 24, she said after a moment, and my father 2 years after. Different causes, close together. I know what it's like to keep walking into rooms and recalculating who isn't there. Irina looked at her with the first expression that wasn't perfectly composed. Yes, she said simply. That's exactly it. They sat for a moment, 2 women at a long table with a window full of grey sky, not requiring anything from each other except presence. Then Irina set down her cup and said, Tell me what you'd change about how these dinners are run. Stefan Crew heard about the foundation meeting from his assistant. He heard about the earlier dinner, the water glass, the woman from accounts, from his mother, who mentioned it with a casualness he recognized immediately as its opposite. Irina only mentioned things casually, when they had, in fact, lodged somewhere she couldn't easily move them. He was 41 years old, and he had spent the majority of his adult life navigating a world that operated on threat and leverage, where relationships were maintained by the precise management of what each party knew about the other. He was exceptionally good at it. He was also profoundly tired of it, in ways he didn't examine too closely. Because examination would require deciding what to do about it, and he had not yet been willing to do that. He attended the Foundation's planning meeting, 3 weeks into the initiative, ostensibly to review the budget projections. His mother had requested it. He sat across the table from Sorcha Finley, who acknowledged him with a nod and then returned to the agenda without adjusting her presentation by a single word. He noted this. He'd spent his life watching people change size in his presence, becoming louder, quieter, more agreeable, more nervous. Sorcha Finley continued to be exactly Sorcha Finley. She had the initiative documents color-coded. She'd prepared 2 alternative models for the dinner rotation based on the Foundation's current volunteer capacity. She'd already spoken to 2 hospitality colleges about partnering on staff training. When his mother asked for a recommendation, Sorcha gave one. When he asked a question about cost variance, she answered it without hedging and without looking to Irina, first to see whether it was safe. He had not met many people like that. On the way out, he held the door. "You do this every week?" he asked, meaning the meetings, meaning the initiative, meaning the general situation of caring about it. "I do now," she said and walked through. The weeks turned. He found reasons to attend more of the Foundation's planning sessions than strictly necessary. She found reasons that were, in her case, entirely necessary. She was genuinely embedded in the project. Building systems, training volunteers, troubleshooting the kinds of small logistical disasters that only become visible to the person paying close attention. He watched her once through the window of the meeting room when she didn't know he was there. A volunteer had made a mistake on the dietary records for an upcoming dinner. 64 guests, and the spreadsheet was wrong in ways that would have been a minor catastrophe. Sorcha had caught it during a final check, 2 hours before the event. She didn't announce it. She sat down with the volunteer, who was mortified, and they fixed it together. When the volunteer apologized again afterward, Sorcha said, "We caught it. That's the job." Nothing more. He went home that evening and thought about what it would take, in his world, to be the kind of person who could say that with that particular ease. He wasn't sure he had an answer. He wasn't sure he'd been asked the question before. One rainy evening in late autumn, after the Foundation's largest dinner to date, 200 guests, every detail smooth, he found himself walking through the parking structure beside Sorcha, who was carrying the last of the event binders back to her car. "Let me take one," he said. She handed it over without commentary on the offer. They walked in silence for a moment. The structure smelled of concrete and cold. "My mother says you were nervous the first time you met her," he said. "I was terrified." He glanced at her. "You didn't act it." "Well." She shifted the remaining binder to her other arm. "I was more afraid of making things worse for her than I was of her. The fear didn't go away. It just wasn't the loudest thing in the room." He stopped walking. She stopped a step after. "My mother spent 40 years surrounded by people who either feared her name or wanted something from it," he said. She stopped expecting anything else a long time ago. "I know," Sorcha said quietly. "And yet," he looked at her directly for the first time that evening. "You came back to check whether she was cold." Sorcha tilted her head slightly, as though the question genuinely puzzled her. Someone had just spilled cold water near her. It seemed important to check. It wasn't a strategy. No. The concrete echoed faintly around them. Somewhere above, a car engine started and receded. "My mother used to say," he began slowly, "that people either saw her name or they saw her." She stopped expecting the second one a long time ago. He paused. "Until you." Sorcha looked at him with an expression that was careful and open at the same time, the expression of someone who understands that the moment they're in is significant and is choosing not to collapse it by responding too quickly. "She deserved to be seen," she said. "So do you." He hadn't expected that. He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for the calculation he'd trained himself to find in everyone. There wasn't any. There was simply sincerity, plain and unhurried, the way she appeared to offer everything. "I think," he said, "you might be the first person in a very long time to say that to me, as though they meant it." "I did mean it." He exhaled slowly. The cold air was visible between them. "May I drive you home?" he asked. She thought about it for a real moment, which he appreciated. She didn't say yes because he'd asked. And she didn't say no because she was uncertain. She said yes because she'd decided. "Yes," she said. "All right." The night of the Foundation's annual gala, the hall on the building's ground floor had been opened up and fitted with long tables dressed in white linen, candles at every setting, and wildflowers in simple glass jars at the center of each arrangement. Sorcha's idea, because the original proposal had called for elaborate centerpieces, and made the guests feel watched rather than welcomed. Or she moved through the room the way she always moved, noticing the things that needed noticing, quietly attending to the things that could be fixed, stopping to speak with guests in the particular way she'd always spoken with people, which was to say, as though she had time. Irina, at the head table, watched her. Stefan, beside his mother, watched both of them. When the formal portion of the evening began, Irina spoke briefly and to the point. About the Foundation's work, about what it was for, about what it had learned in its first real year of the dining program. She didn't read from notes. Near the end, a journalist in the third row raised her hand. Mrs. Crewe, many people have noticed the role Sorcha Finley has played in shaping this program. How would you describe her contribution? The room settled. Irina looked across the hall to where Sorcha was standing near the back, slightly flushed, clearly wishing to be elsewhere. She taught us, Irina said, that the quality of a meal has very little to do with the quality of the food. She paused. When I first met Sorcha Finley, someone had just spilled cold water near my chair. Every person in that room was bracing for my reaction. Every person except her. Another pause. She asked whether I was cold. The room was very quiet. In my experience, people respond to my family's name with obedience or with fear. What they rarely offer is the thing that costs nothing and means everything. She looked at her son for a moment, then back at the room. She offered it to everyone in equal measure, the guests who came through our program this year, the volunteers, the kitchen staff, my son. She smiled, not the contained, strategic smile she used in business, but a genuine one, and it changed her face completely. He didn't bring her into this family. She brought us back to each other. The applause started slowly, and then filled the room. Sorcha, at the back, pressed one hand briefly over her mouth and then lowered it. She wasn't performing composure. She simply hadn't expected it, and surprise for her had always looked like stillness. Stefan crossed the room to where she was standing. He didn't make a speech of it. He placed his hand gently at her back and waited until she looked at him, and then he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "She's been waiting a long time to say that." "I know," Sorcha said. Her voice wasn't entirely steady. "So have I." She looked at him. He held her gaze. And then she reached up and took his hand from her back and held it in both of hers, the way you hold something you intend to keep, and neither of them said anything else, because neither of them needed to. Irina, at the front of the room, watched her son smile, fully, freely, without calculation, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She had spent 4 decades building a family's power. She had learned to measure everything by what it cost and what it produced. But watching the woman who had crouched beside her chair and asked, simply, whether she was cold, watching that woman stand in the back of a candlelit hall, holding her son's hand with both of hers. Irina understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has stopped needing to be right, that the greatest things in her life had never been built. They had arrived. They had arrived carrying nothing but their own plain, unhurried kindness, and they had been worth every year of waiting.